Hello everybody, welcome back to Sound Design September. Today we're going to be taking a look at this patch over here. And this patch implements one unique trick that I don't really see being talked about anywhere else. So that's going to be the main focus of today's video. So you can hear that we get this bubbly sound out of this particular patch. And the way that I would describe it is as a very fast modulation. Now, if we look over here, there isn't really any fast modulations happening here. You would expect it to maybe come from the LFOs over here or maybe using the noise oscillator, but we're not using any of that. You can actually see, apart from some old experimentation that is just a little bit of residue from when I was experimenting with this patch, you can see that there's not really much going on this particular page of the synth. All that we have is we have a saw wave where we're controlling the pitch with a macro. The actual main effect that we're hearing is this phaser over here. And the cool thing about the phaser is that when it comes to its rate of modulation, you can set it up higher than you would expect. Normally with a phaser, you'll hear it playing over maybe say 4 bars or 8 bars or even 16 bars. Or you have an unsynced rate of a similar length. So that would of course be like a very low hertz value, say like 0.15 or 0.07, something like that. But if we turn it up all the way to 20 hertz, we're almost going to get into like audio rate territory here. Now I could, if I wanted to, use an LFO and set up a shape over here in a noise oscillator and then just manually modulate the frequency as an even higher rate if I wanted to. But it's this kind of magical area where you're in between like an actual modulation rate and an audio rate, where we're not quite doing like audio rate modulation. So it's very clear that we can still hear almost like the individual sweeps ups and downs from this patch, but it's clearly not the kind of modulation that you would normally get out of a phaser, which, as I said before, is just that like very slow, say 8-bar modulation, where you're actually like changing the tonality over time. Now, of course, there's some other things going on in this patch as well. We have a hyper dimension over here. We have the EQ to remove some lower frequencies, and then we have a delay over here as well. As I said before, we're using the macro to control the pitch over here. You don't have to worry about this macro because it is linked to the filter cutoff that we're no longer using here. And then the final thing to just add a little bit of extra randomness here is modulating the frequency with a note on random here. So it's going to, for every note that we play, set a random position of this frequency here. And then of course the frequency of the phaser is also going to be modulated by the internal modulation that the phaser has itself, which is the whole trick that we talked about before. Now, when it comes to this trick, there's much more that you can do with it. Of course, you can implement it in whatever patch that you want. You are always going to get a very similar bubbly result out of this particular trick. If that is what you're after, then this is what I would use. But I just want to make another patch just to show you that you can get slightly different sounds out of it. In order to do that, in this case, we're going to again use Serum here. There's probably also other synths and even external phasers that may be able to do this. And if you really want to experiment, there's also a flanger that does the same thing. As you can see, 20 hertz up here, which is what we were doing with the phaser as well. Before we get into this patch though, I do want to give a quick reminder that both the patch that we just played and the patch that we're going to make are going to be on my Patreon page. So if you want to get those, make sure that you go over there and sign up for my Patreon. But with that out of the way, let's get into this patch over here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to set up a basic FM setup using the sub oscillator here. And we're going to just FM it like this. I'm going to find a nice tone for that. Of course, let's set the level down and the randomness down over here as well, which we learned in yesterday's video. Maybe something like that. And then we'll add a bandpass to this. You probably see where I'm going with this if we just randomize this here. You get your classical kind of particle sounds, especially if you make a little bit of a longer release. Just to get the actual particle effect, we'll already set up the delay here. For some reason, my cursor changed to a hand for a little while there. I don't know what that's about. But there you have your basic particles. And now, like we saw before, we can just use the phaser. We get our kind of classical phaser idea here, where it's just slowly changing the timbre of the sound, slowly changing kind of the tonality of the sound. But let's bump this rate all the way up like this. Maybe select a different frequency, a little bit more depth here. You can hear we seem to get the most effect when we lower the frequency by quite a bit. We can also turn up the feedback to get a more like strong tonality out of it. course, with zero feedback, it isn't really going to do much. So we do want to have quite a high feedback here. Now, as I said before, the goal really is to be in between kind of the modulation rate and the audio rate in terms of how fast this phaser is moving up and down. But let's say that you're not entirely happy with the actual rate that we're going to get here and you want to just go a little bit higher than this. What we can do is use the noise oscillator, like I said before, as a modulator. So we'll go back in here, turn on the noise oscillator, and then turn down its level. You can just drag an LFO in there. In this case, we are going for a triangle shape, so that is already set up. But let's say that you want to go, I don't know, for a sine wave, which just comes standard with Serum. You can drag that in there. It doesn't update. It doesn't show you that you should set up a new shape, but any time that you just drag and drop in here, it will actually update the shape. And now we can set the modulation depth all the way to 0, so that we're not actually going to get this modulation over here. And we can manually modulate this with the noise oscillator. And then this will be our depth control. So this is the depth here. That is now being taken care of by this modulation mount over here. And of course, we also need to set up the noise oscillator in the right way. So what we're going to do is we're just going to key track this. And now we can turn it up to, say, 36 here. And now we get something that sounds like this. Again, here it's still a little bit slower, but we can tune it up more if we want to. You can hear that in this case at 60 semitones, which is 5 octaves higher, we get like a stable tone out of it. So at 48 semitones, we're going to kind of sit in that sweet spot here. In this case, what I want to do is I want to remove the lower frequencies. Something like that. And maybe we want to set a different phase here. Now, the final thing that I want to do is introduce a little bit of stereo width. The first idea that I had to do that was just to turn up the unison to 2 and to set the detune like this. This usually does the trick, but in this case, it doesn't actually stereonize the phaser effect here. So this doesn't really mean anything. We can set that back to 1. It doesn't really do what we want it to do. The second thing that I thought of doing is using the stereo phase offset over here, but this is tied to the LFO, which we're currently not using. So I don't think there is a nice way to stereonize the left and the right channel separately in this particular case. So what I want to do instead is I want to make another patch, this time inside of Vital, that uses the same effect. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to do something very simple. Again, we can use an FM setup like we did before with the particles here, but we can also make a different type of sound actually. Let's in this case just go for a different modulator on this. Again, I'll give this a little bit more release, so it's a nice like particle sound. And then in this case, what we could do is just use the phaser that sits in here. So this comes with a phaser like that, and we can set the amount of pulse that we want. Again, we have the feedback over here, which is basically the same as the resonance of the filter type. So you can see we get more resonant and less resonant like this. Let's go with a lower amount of pulse. And what we can do in Vital is we can actually set this to key track here. So now we have an octave lower than the key that we're playing. Of course, we're playing in the sub bass register. So we're going to immediately get bubbles if we start modulating stuff. And the interesting thing about Vital is that you have the stereo over here. So we can just slightly offset the left and right channel. You can actually see that we get 2 different graphs here. And now we get an actual proper stereo effect from that phaser. Now, this is not the most interesting patch right now, so let's make it a little bit more interesting by adding randomness to the FM amount. Again, if we want to, we can also push it through a bandpass. Let's enable filter 1 going through here, and let's disable oscillator 1 over here, so that the bandpass is going first. Let's set it to 24 dB per octave, and we'll use a different randomization over here. That can be interesting. Let's add a compressor to bring out a little bit of the frequencies. Remove the lower frequencies over here. And then let's delay it here. Actually, for the randomness, I'm quickly going to set this to sine interpolate because the burden seems to always kind of start from the same position. This seems to be a little bit more interesting. And then, of course, for our classical sidetrans delay, we're going to go with 1/8 dotted ping pong. And I think that shows that there's some really cool patches that you can make using this technique. So I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned something from this. Let me know if you did by leaving a like and make sure that you subscribed. Again, the patches that we've made in this video will be available on my Patreon, so if you want them, you can get them there. Another way to support me is by watching some more of my content, so there will be 2 videos up on the screen right now for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.